My daughter turned my house into her hotel, and when I removed every door, she finally understood who was in charge. My name is Michael. I'm 54 years old, and what I'm about to tell you is not a story about forgiveness, because there are limits that, once crossed, turn blood into ice. My daughter thought my house was a free hotel for her and her lazy boyfriend, but she forgot one small detail. I am not an ATM, and I am certainly not a passive spectator to my own humiliation. Watching the look of desperation on her face when she realized that what she believed was a right was actually a privilege I had just revoked was the most satisfying moment of my life. Some people believe they can trample your peace simply because they share your last name, but I learned the hard way that respect is earned, and the lack of it is paid with interest. She thought she could invade my space, bring a stranger into my property, and treat me like an intruder in my own living room. She was wrong. The shock she felt when she came back and discovered that I had removed absolutely every door in the house, including the bathroom door, was only the beginning of her nightmare. If you enjoy stories where betrayal has consequences and justice arrives without warning, leave a like and subscribe. Here we share real stories of revenge and lessons that are never forgotten. For years I built what I considered a refuge. I worked in the logistics sector, a profession that teaches you that if a single piece doesn't fit, the entire system collapses. My house was that perfect system. After my wife passed away almost a decade ago, I dedicated myself to keeping that place impeccable. It wasn't just bricks and cement, it was my order, my silence, the result of 30 years of early mornings and difficult decisions. I have always been a man of few words, the kind who prefers to observe before acting. My daughter Emily was always different. She had that spark of rebellion that at first I found amusing, but over time it turned into a sense of entitlement over everything that belonged to me. She grew up watching my effort, but she never understood it. For her, money simply appeared in the account, and the house somehow maintained itself by magic. When she finished college, or rather, when she stopped going, she started jumping from one job to another. She never lasted more than 3 months. She said her bosses didn't understand her vision, that the environment was toxic. I would listen in silence, pouring myself a cup of coffee, knowing the problem wasn't the world, but her lack of backbone. Despite everything, she lived on her own in a small apartment that I helped pay for. We had a cordial relationship, the kind maintained with one dinner a month and short text messages. I was at peace. I enjoyed my mornings reading the newspaper and my afternoons tending the garden. But then he appeared. Jason, a guy about 28 years old with the air of a misunderstood artist and a pathological inability to look a real man in the eye. Emily introduced him to me during a lunch. He didn't even take his cap off at the table. He spent the entire time checking his phone and talking about his investment projects, which translated into real English meant borrowing money from anyone foolish enough to be deceived. I noticed the way she looked at him, with that blind devotion only people who don't value themselves possess. That afternoon after they left, I felt a knot in my stomach. I knew that man was a parasite, and that sooner or later he would look for a bigger host. 2 weeks later, Emily called me crying. She said the owner of the apartment had unfairly asked them to leave the property. A lie. I later found out they hadn't paid the rent for 4 months. She asked if they could stay in my house just for a few days, while they found something new. My instinct told me no. My logic screamed at me to put a lock on the door. But I made the mistake many parents make. I confused pity with love. I allowed them to come in. On the first day they arrived with 6 suitcases and a giant television that he didn't even help carry. I watched him from the doorway, arms crossed, while he whistled a tune and walked through my living room as if he owned the place. "Thanks, father-in-law," he said with a cynical smile, while dropping his dirty shoes onto my wool rug. I didn't answer. I simply went upstairs to my study and closed the door. The balance of my life broke in less than 72 hours. My kitchen, which had always smelled like coffee and clean wood, now reeked of fast food and cigarette ash. Emily and Jason woke up at noon. I left for work at 7 in the morning and returned at 6 in the evening to find my refrigerator empty and dirty dishes piled up in the sink. I tried to talk to Emily. I brought her into the kitchen and pointed at the mess. She simply rolled her eyes and said I was being too rigid, that I needed to relax because now we were a family living together. Jason, from the couch, shouted that I shouldn't worry, that he would take care of everything once he got a break from his online job. His job consisted of playing video games until 4 in the morning while yelling at a screen. What hurt me the most wasn't the physical mess, but the invasion of my authority. I was a stranger in my own property. If I wanted to watch the news, they were occupying the main television. If I wanted to sleep, I had to endure their laughter and loud music until dawn. Emily stopped looking for a job. She became his shadow, his servant, and I became the invisible provider paying for the electricity, the water, and the food they consumed without the slightest gesture of gratitude. I would sit down for dinner, and they wouldn't even ask how my day had been. They talked to each other, sharing private jokes, completely ignoring me at the head of my own table. One night I went down to the kitchen for a glass of water and found Jason digging through my drawer of personal documents. When he saw me, he didn't panic. He didn't apologize. He simply closed the drawer slowly and told me he was looking for a pen. A liar. He was looking for something valuable, something he could sell or use. In that moment, the anger I had been holding back like a dam about to burst turned into something different. It wasn't an explosion, it was crystallization. My mind became cold, analytical. I understood that words wouldn't work with them. Rules meant nothing because they respected no law except their own comfort. Emily was no longer the daughter I had raised. She was the accomplice of an invader. And in my world, invaders are not asked politely to leave. Invaders have their comfort destroyed until the very place they want so badly becomes an unbearable prison. I went to sleep that night with a strange calm. I was no longer angry. I was focused. The plan began to take shape in my head with the precision of an architectural blueprint. They believed my house was their refuge. They were about to discover that I owned every square inch of it, and that I could do whatever I wanted with my property. The tension reached its breaking point on a Tuesday afternoon. I arrived home after an exhausting day, my body begging for a little silence, but what I found was a slap of reality. My favorite armchair, the one I inherited from my father and treated like a relic, was occupied by Jason. He was shirtless, his bare feet resting on my mahogany coffee table, holding a beer I had saved for the weekend. The smell of marijuana filled the curtains my wife had chosen so carefully years ago. Emily was sitting on the floor, laughing at something he said, surrounded by empty pizza boxes and leftover food already starting to attract insects. I stood in the doorway watching them. My silence is usually a warning, but they interpreted it as weakness. They didn't even move. Emily looked up and gave me an annoyed glance, as if I were the nosy neighbor interrupting a private party. I asked them, with the calmest voice I could fake, to clean up the mess and for Jason to take his feet off the table. He let out a cynical laugh, took a sip of my beer, and stared straight at me. He told me not to be so intense, that the energy in the house felt heavy because of me, and that I should learn to go with the flow. Emily nodded, adding that I was making them feel like tenants instead of family. That word, family. People use it as a shield to justify parasitism. That same night, the conflict escalated. I went into my study to grab my tablet and realized it was missing. I walked to the room I had lent them and opened the door without knocking. There he was, using my device for his stupid games. When I demanded he give it back, Emily stepped in front of me. She stood there with a look of contempt I never thought I'd see in my own blood. She shouted that I had plenty while they had nothing, that I was selfish for complaining about material things, when my daughter was going through a difficult moment. That was when she said the sentence that sealed her fate. "After all, this house will be mine someday, Dad. You should start getting used to sharing it." Jason burst into laughter from the bed. He didn't say anything, but his smile said everything. He saw me as a defeated old man, a guy who simply paid the bills while waiting for the end. In that moment, I felt something inside me disconnect. I didn't feel the urge to yell or hit him, even though my hands trembled with restraint. What I felt was a deep loss, the symbolic expulsion from my own home. They had already thrown me out emotionally from my refuge. I turned around and walked out of the room without saying another word. The following days were a descent into chaos. They began invading my bedroom. I found my clothes moved, my colognes used. One day I came back and discovered they had organized a small gathering with 3 of Jason's friends. There were people I didn't know using my bathroom, sitting in my chairs, dirtying my walls. When I tried to restore order, Jason stood up and got inches away from my face, taking advantage of the fact that he's a bit taller, and said in a low, threatening tone that I shouldn't bother his guests, that Emily was already very stressed because of my control issues, and that they didn't want to have to take legal action for domestic harassment. My own daughter stood behind him with her arms crossed, supporting every word that criminal said. I retreated to the kitchen. I poured myself a glass of water and noticed my hands were no longer shaking. I was decided. Emily's betrayal hurt more than anything else. Seeing her prioritize a stranger who had nothing to his name over the man who had given her everything was the bitterest lesson life had ever taught me. I realized she didn't want a father, she wanted a host. And Jason didn't want a girlfriend, he wanted a property. That night, while I listened to them laughing in the hallway, probably mocking my defeat, I understood that the home I once knew no longer existed. They had burned it down with their disrespect. So if the house was no longer my refuge, then it no longer needed to be a house for them. The final humiliation came when I tried to use my own shower and found that they had used my clean towels to dry their dog, a dog they had brought without permission, and had left them thrown on the floor, soaked and covered in mud. I walked out of the bathroom, passed through the living room where they were dozing in front of the television, and said nothing. Not a complaint, not a reproach. Silence is the most powerful tool of a man who has nothing left to lose because he has already lost everything in his heart. I got dressed, grabbed my car keys and left. As I drove through the empty streets, I started making calls. I didn't call the police because I knew eviction processes are slow and tedious, and they would use every legal loophole to stay. I called an old contact from my construction days, and then a lawyer who knew how to interpret private property laws creatively. If they wanted to live in my house under their own rules of freedom and flow, I was going to give them exactly that. But the concept of freedom I had in mind was far more literal and far more brutal than they could possibly imagine. The plan was already in motion. Rebuilding my peace wouldn't come from throwing them out by force, but from making staying there a physical impossibility. I sat in my car, in the darkness of a random parking lot, and opened my laptop. My mind was working like a well-oiled engine. If they wanted to use the law to barricade themselves inside my house, I would use my property rights to dismantle their comfort. I called my lawyer, a man named Saul, as cold and calculated as I was. I explained the situation without embellishment. I wasn't looking for comfort. I was looking for strategy. "Michael," Saul said in a calm voice, "a formal eviction can take months, even a year if she claims vulnerability. But the house is yours. Legally, you have the right to carry out repairs, maintenance, or structural renovations as long as you don't permanently cut basic services." I allowed myself the first smile I had in weeks. I didn't need to throw them out. I needed the environment to become so hostile that even the dirtiest park would seem like a palace compared to my living room. The first step was financial. I went to the bank and closed the joint account Emily still used for her emergencies. I cancelled the additional credit cards. I cut off the flow of economic oxygen. Then I called a storage company. I rented a large container to be placed on the sidewalk in front of the house the next day. I wasn't going to throw their things away. I was going to protect mine. During the next 2 days, I acted with a calmness that confused them. I didn't complain about the mess. I didn't protest the noise. I even bought Jason a beer. He thought I had surrendered, that I had finally accepted my role as a submissive provider. Poor idiot. While he sank deeper into the couch, I mentally measured every frame, every hinge. I wrote down every detail in a notebook I kept in my car. On Wednesday, taking advantage of the fact that they left for a couple of hours, probably using the little money they had left to buy junk food, I put Phase 1 into motion. My construction contact arrived with 3 workers. In less than 90 minutes, we removed all the valuable furniture, my paintings, my wife's crystalware, and my electronic equipment. Everything went straight into the storage container. I left the house empty, except for the bed they slept on, and the old couch Jason loved so much. But that was only the wrapping. The real counterattack was psychological and structural. I remembered what Emily had said about sharing and flowing. Well, we were going to flow. I started unscrewing the doors, all of them. I began with the front door, replacing it with a metal security gate that allowed anyone to see inside and let the cold night air pass through. Then I continued with the interior doors. I removed the door to their bedroom while their underwear was scattered across the floor. I removed the bathroom door, the kitchen door, and the study door. My house became a skeleton of concrete. There was no privacy. There were no corners left to hide. If Jason wanted to use the toilet, he would have to do it in front of anyone walking through the hallway. If they wanted intimacy, the entire world could witness it through the front gate. The lack of privacy is one of the most effective psychological tortures that exists, and I was applying it with surgical precision inside my own home. As I worked, I felt a strange release. Every screw I removed was another gram of weight lifted from my shoulders. I wasn't destroying my house, I was stripping it bare to cleanse it of parasites. I also installed high-definition security cameras in every corner of the common areas. Cameras with microphones and night vision. I made sure they knew, through signs taped to the bare walls, that every movement was being recorded for security reasons due to recent unauthorized visitors. When we finished, the house looked like a war zone, or a twisted minimalist art gallery. I sat on a folding chair in the middle of the empty living room, my notebook in hand, waiting for the sound of their return. I knew Emily would scream. I knew Jason would try to act brave. But I also knew that legally, I was within my right to renovate my property. I had removed the privileges one by one. They were no longer tenants in a cozy house. They were occupants in a concrete structure under constant surveillance. My patience had ended, and my reconstruction had only just begun. Justice isn't always a hammer. Sometimes it's a screwdriver, removing the defenses of the person who betrayed you. The sound of Emily's car engine announced their arrival. I remained motionless in my folding chair in the center of the empty living room, breathing the cold air now circulating freely from the street through the metal gate. I heard them laughing as they walked toward the entrance, but the laughter stopped abruptly when the metal bars blocked their path. Emily struggled with the key, confused, until she saw me sitting there, surrounded by bare walls and cables hanging from the ceiling. "Dad, what is this? Why won't the door open?" she shouted from the other side. I stood up slowly, walked to the gate, and unlocked it. I didn't say a word. They froze when they stepped inside. Jason looked toward where the 60-inch television used to be and found nothing but a wall with empty brackets. Emily ran to the kitchen expecting to find dinner waiting, but all she found were empty shelves. The house was no longer a house. It was an echo chamber where every step bounced back hollow and cold. "Michael, you've gone crazy," Jason roared, trying to recover his alpha male posture. "Our stuff! Where's our stuff?" I pointed with my finger toward the room where they slept. That's when the real blow hit them. They saw their bedroom had no door. They saw the bathroom directly across the hall, completely exposed to the corridor. There were no curtains, no rugs, no refuge. Emily panicked. She started screaming that this was illegal, that I couldn't treat my own daughter like this. "I haven't touched your things, Emily," I said, keeping my voice flat, almost robotic. "Everything that belongs to you is in that room. Everything that belongs to me, including the privacy this house once provided, left with my furniture. You said you wanted to flow. Well, now the air flows freely through the entire house." Jason tried to step closer to me, puffing his chest, but he stopped when I pointed to the security camera with a blinking red light right above his head. "Every word, every gesture, and any attempt at aggression is being transmitted to a cloud server and directly to my lawyer's office," I warned him. "If you touch me, you won't just be out on the street, you'll be in a jail cell before sunrise. And by the way, the internet service now has a 30-character password that only I know. If you want to play games, use your mobile data, if you still have credit on your phone." That night became a climax of misery for them. I stayed in my study, also without a door, sitting in my office chair, the only piece of furniture I had left, watching through my tablet as they wandered around the house like ghosts. Jason tried to use the bathroom, but the humiliation of being exposed to the living room and the camera made him give up. They wrapped themselves in old blankets while the night wind came in through the metal gate. I could hear them whispering, arguing with each other. Emily blamed him for his uselessness, and he shouted that her father was a psychopath. The irony was delicious. For weeks they had fed off my peace, my food and my space. Now they were devouring each other. There was no music to drown out their arguments, no food to calm their anxiety, no corners to hide their shame. At 3 in the morning, Jason snapped. He stormed into the hallway yelling that he couldn't live like this, that it was torture. I stepped out of my study, looked him straight in the eyes and said, "No one is forcing you to stay here. The gate opens from the inside. You're free to leave and find a place that better fits your lifestyle. But as long as you're under my roof, these are the conditions of my property under renovation." Emily was crying, sitting on the mattress, thrown on the floor of a room without walls. She looked at me, searching for a spark of that father who always gave in, who always rescued her. She found nothing. My gaze was a mirror that reflected only her own ingratitude. Watching the shock on her face as she realized the old man not only had teeth, but was willing to use them to dismantle her world, was the most bitter and perfect victory I had ever tasted. There were no screams from me, only the metallic sound of my tools as I adjusted one final camera. They were defeated, exposed, and for the first time in their lives, completely responsible for their own discomfort. The next morning, there was no need for long speeches. Jason was the first to leave, carrying 2 trash bags filled with his clothes and the television he loved to brag about, which now looked ridiculous in such a raw environment. Emily followed shortly after, her eyes swollen and her face twisted with disbelief. She didn't say goodbye. There was no, "I'm sorry," no, "I love you." There was only a heavy silence, broken by the metallic screech of the gate closing behind them. I watched them walk away from the doorway, 2 small figures finally realizing that life is not a free banquet paid for by someone else. The consequences were immediate. Emily tried to call me a couple of times, asking for money for a hotel, but my answer was always the same: silence. Through a few mutual acquaintances, I later learned they ended up living in a temporary shelter, and that their relationship, stripped of the comfort I had financed, fell apart in less than a week. It turns out Jason's love wasn't so strong when there was no leather couch to rest on and no refrigerator full of food to raid. She now works at a convenience store, paying for a shared room. It's the first time in her 24 years that she truly understands the cost of the bread she eats. As for me, I moved my furniture back into the house a week later. I reinstalled the doors, But every time I close one now, the satisfaction feels different. The house once again smells like coffee and clean wood. My peace has returned, even though the price was the complete break with my only daughter. Many people will judge me, saying a father should endure everything, that family stands above dignity. I believe the opposite. If you allow people to trample you in the name of love, what you feel isn't love, it's slavery. I chose my freedom. I learned that blood makes you related, but loyalty and respect make you family. I sat in my recovered armchair, enjoying the silence I fought so hard to defend, and realized I regret nothing. Sometimes you have to tear down the walls to see who is truly on your side and who was only looking for shade. Sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's watching life collect its debts. If this story felt as intense to you as it was for me to live it, leave a like and tell me in the comments what you would have done. And if you're not subscribed yet, turn on the bell so you don't miss the next stories.